Greetings everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything right here on Sifted Games at Sifted.net. I am Shane Satterfield, the founder of Sifted, and this show lets me connect with our fans, our patrons, anybody who's interested in video games, Sifted, me, music, sport, whatever. You can ask about whatever you want on this show, and please do that. Go to Sifted.net. In the header there's a link where you can go to our forums. Click on that link, go in there, ask me a question about anything, as long as it's not crazy personal. This show does happen because a lot of you, boys and girls, are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/sifted. Thank you so much. I really enjoy doing this show. It's a chance for us to connect. It's a nice little reprieve for me in the middle of the week. I hope you guys enjoy watching it. Let's get to this week's questions. First up, we have a question from Kevin. What is your favorite video game box art? Oh, that's a great question, Kevin. And I will say this. I think people who have been playing games as long as I have, and probably as long as you have as well, I think they will have different perspectives on box art, because box art used to be a lot more important than it is now. So picking one game, I'll get to that. I'm going to go with an era instead. So I'm going to go with the arcade / Atari 2600 era of arcade cabinet and box art. And the reason why that stuff is more important to me than, hey, what's the coolest box art between like Grand Theft Auto 5 and Destiny 2? Those box art pieces are just basically focusing on and showing you what the game actually looks like. If you go back to the Atari 2600 in the arcade days, the graphics in games were so crude that sometimes you would look at something without somebody telling you what it was supposed to be, and you'd be like, what is that? And so the box art for those Atari 2600 games told you what the games were supposed to look like. Or another way of putting it is, what these games would look like if they were made in 2025. And believe me, back in the late 70s, early 80s, 2025, I didn't even think that we would get here. So it seems so far into the future. I mean, I thought we'd have everyone be in flying cars by now, and that hasn't worked out. So anyway, it filled in the blanks. It gave your imagination the ammunition that it needed to create what the game is supposed to look like in your mind. And that's why box art back then was so important. And one thing that Atari did that was really, really smart was that it had artists almost like paint the box art for its games. Like, they're not like digitally created, because it was, back then there was no such thing. Photoshop didn't even exist yet. So they had artists actually paint renditions of what the games were supposed to look like. And so if I have to pick one game where the box art told me the most, it's Space Invaders. And that's not just the box art for the Atari 2600 version of Space Invaders. It's also the arcade cabinet. The arcade cabinet art for Space Invaders is freaking awesome. When you were a kid, or I was a kid in the arcades, a lot of times you go into the arcade and you'd have a couple dollars or whatever. You'd be there for 30 or 40 minutes and all your money would be gone. And at least I would, then spend the rest of my time that I had wandering around the arcade looking for people who had lots of money and watching them play games to see if they could get further in those arcade games that I could ever get, because they had the money to do so. Dragon's Lair was a big game like that. If somebody came into the arcade that looked a little older, like an adult, and walked up to play Dragon's Lair, everybody in the arcade went to Dragon's Lair. Because most people, it was $1 per play. Most people could not afford to get past the first 10 or 12 screens of Dragon's Lair. But every once in a while, a whale would walk into the arcade and you would go and everyone would go and watch them play Dragon's Lair. That happened all the time. And so a lot of times for me in arcades, I didn't have money to play, so I was just wandering around looking at the arcade machines, and the art on the side of those cabinets, in a lot of ways, filled you in on what the games were supposed to look like. Now in the arcades, obviously games looked a little bit better. Move over to the home console, Atari 2600, those games look really crude. And so the box art on those games really sold what the games were supposed to look like and what they were supposed to be about, and it let your imagination run wild. So the era that it was the best is the Atari 2600, the arcade, and if I had to pick one game, it would be Space Invaders. Okay, our next question comes from Joaquim Dragoon. With games officially heading to $80 in the near future, do you foresee other companies going the Game Pass route? At the same time, with Nintendo's new approach to physical games, do you think game sales will go down over time? Well, here's the thing, Joaquim Dragoon. Most companies can't afford to do Game Pass. In fact, Microsoft is probably the only company in the gaming space that can afford to do Game Pass. The initial cash outlay just to get past your first few months is astronomical, because you have to give all these publishers, developers money for these games that you're putting on your service, and you're not generating any revenue. And you probably won't generate any revenue, at least in significant amounts, for months and months. So you need to be able to eat those costs, those startup costs to launch something like Game Pass. And again, only Microsoft can really afford to do something like that. The only other fringe option might be Nintendo. Michael Pachter has talked about this on Pachter Factor a couple different times, about how he thinks Nintendo should launch some kind of monthly service where you pay them $5 a month to play all its old 2D games, something like that along those lines. Nintendo could almost pull off a Game Pass with its own software, because it's been making games all along. Xbox only started making games around 2000 with the original Xbox. So Nintendo has a nice head start on, honestly, both Xbox and PlayStation as far as that's concerned. So Nintendo might be able to pull it off with its own stuff. I don't think Nintendo would want to get into the mess of having to license third-party games and money hat developers and publishers and compete with Microsoft on that front. What I'm getting at is it will never happen. Nintendo's never going to do Game Pass. In fact, no other video game publisher is going to do Game Pass. I don't even know if they could afford to do it, if they would do it. So I think what you're going to get instead, and what we are getting, are these publishers giving us their own little subscription service. Ubisoft has one, EA has one. But for the most part, those services are just playing EA's games and just playing Ubisoft's games. It's not playing third-party games from competitors. And that's what becomes another problem, is if you're a Ubisoft or an EA, do you want to launch a service that's selling and promoting other publishers' games? Probably not. As far as sales are concerned, I don't really see how anything related to this question will affect sales, other than sales maybe going down on their own independent of Game Pass or some other publisher launching a Game Pass like service. I don't really see how that would impact overall sales. So there's myriad reasons why that will never work, but the biggest one is just not having the cash to really launch it. Okay, next up we have a question from Ben. Your Oblivion discussion on Game Face led me to reflecting on level scaling. I really don't like it. To me, it feels counterintuitive to put effort into improving a character only for enemies to follow your growth. I think this might be why the Souls-like loop is so compelling. Enemies are static, and you can choose when to take on more powerful or weaker enemies. Ben, I agree with you 1,000%. I also do not understand the purpose behind level scaling enemies to match the level of the player's character. You never feel strong, you never feel weak, you just feel the same for the entire time that you play the game. And I will say this, when you're tuning a combat engine and trying to figure out like how much damage this attack should do with this weapon versus that weapon and all that stuff, level scaling helps with that big time. Because you know what to expect. You know how good the player has to be to succeed. Now, when you get into level scaling with games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring, now Elden Ring obviously was different. It was an open world game, and you could kind of wander around wherever you want. But when you talk about Dark Souls in particular, you're right. There are enemies littered throughout the game that are all different levels. You're not just fighting enemies who feel the same every time you get into a fight. However, sometimes in those games, you can wander into areas where you're not supposed to be and fight enemies you shouldn't be fighting and just get completely wiped out. And so one thing I would say is, one, I think that is the right approach. I think the way Dark Souls does it, Elden Ring does it, is right. You should be able to choose whether you want to have an even fight, go out of your comfort zone and try to fight an enemy that's tougher and maybe get more XP, or just farm and kill lowly enemies and just slowly build up your XP so you can level up, grinding basically. So I do agree that you want to be able to do all those things. However, with one caveat, they have to display the enemy's level above their heads before you engage with them. Now, to be fair, most games have done that. Most RPGs you play now, if you're in open world, you can see there's a little like red skull above the enemy or something telling you like, hey, you probably don't want to mess with this. Most games do that. And one thing I'll say about that is that it shows you how the industry and games evolve, and you may not even realize it. Most RPGs 20 years ago were like Oblivion. They thought to themselves like, well, you can't make it too easy, you can't make it too hard, so let's just make sure the enemies are right in the wheelhouse of the player. All RPGs were doing that back then. It's wrong to single out Oblivion, and I'm not saying you're doing that, but generally it's wrong to single out Oblivion and say, why did you do that? Because every game was doing it that way. But developers have learned over time that that's not the way to make a compelling game. The player needs peaks and valleys, and you need a valley so that you can enjoy the peaks. When everything's just zero, the game feels zero, unless it's exceptional, like Oblivion. And developers have learned over time that that is how games should be made. I mean, I think back to like those times, like 20 years ago, who could have imagined what games would be like now? But over time, developers have just taken feedback, focus groups, all that stuff, and evolved games into what they are now. So, I guess I would agree with you. I also hate level scaling. It makes games feel very, very vanilla. But also, if you're going to do it the other way, there's a couple things that you have to do. Okay, our last question this week comes from Sifted newcomer Zagadka. Have you considered interviewing retired or semi-retired game developers for Sifted? I get the impression that you know almost everyone in the industry. The current latest news is often pretty bleak, with layoffs, price increases, cancellations, the AI takeover, etc. It might be fun and interesting to talk to developers about the good old days sometimes. I know I would listen. First of all, Zagadka, welcome to Sifted. Always good to see new users, and especially new users who go and ask questions for Ask Shane Anything almost immediately. So thank you very much. Welcome to the site. Welcome to our awesome community of older players who mostly act like adults. Hope you enjoy your time here. Now on to answering your question. When I first launched Sifted, I was throwing everything against the wall, trying to figure out what people liked and what I could do. A lot of what we do or don't do on Sifted is guided by my time commitments, money, and interest. And most importantly, interest. Like if there's something that you guys really, really like and you guys really, really want, I will figure out a way to do it. But when we're talking about interviews, and we often call them developer docs here on Sifted, that's something that we brought over from game trailers to Sifted, because a lot of times these things aren't really just interviews. They're kind of like interviews, but a preview at the same time. So anyway, on Sifted, we call them developer docs. And you can see, and I can see, that nobody watches them. The metrics just aren't there. You guys don't care. They are the least popular type of content on Sifted, by far. So when I first launched the site, we did a couple interviews. We didn't do a ton of them. I was trying to figure out, can I do industry events? Will that work? No, it doesn't work. Because you have to leave and go set up, do the interview, tear down, come back. That's a whole day. I can't afford to take a whole day to do something like that. And also, you guys aren't interested in it. So I'm definitely not going to do something like that for something you guys probably aren't going to watch. So unfortunately, now I will say this. I see that you have a new twist on it. You want me to go back and talk to the older folks about the history of the industry and great stories from when they were first figuring out how to make. I get it. To me, that's interesting too. Unfortunately, to most people, it's not. So even with that kind of different twist on it, as far as like a cost-benefit analysis is concerned, it probably just doesn't work out, unfortunately. But at the same time, I don't want our patrons and our subscribers to think that this is just a closed book and we don't listen to you guys for ideas or content that you guys may be interested in. We will always listen to what you want. It's just a matter of whether we can pull it off from a time perspective and from a financial perspective. Okay, that'll do it for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything, a show I absolutely love doing. And so a big, big thanks to those of you who are pledging at $7 or more per month at that Ask Shane Anything tier. Because of you guys and girls, this show happens every week. Because of all our patrons and anyone who helps us in any way, that's why Sifted, the engine keeps turning over here. Appreciate anyone who gives us anything, or even if you're just sharing our episodes on social media. There's so many ways you can help us, and I appreciate all of it. So get those questions in, go to sifted.net, click the link in the header, go to our forums, ask me a question, and we'll be back here next Thursday for another episode of Ask Shane.